we're gonna
Is it a
start
13? Is it a
in
14?
2 minutes.
What? 13. Oh, you'll be
I
fine.
want to give a little preliminary comment. First of all, I would like to thank the Grange and Roberta Roll, its president, for not just making this available, but Roberta's been doing quite a bit of running around in connection with this, including yesterday directing traffic. And I think maybe even air traffic, I'm not sure. Anyway, and I also, he's not here, but Harry Hussey videotaped the first program, and he did a very nice job, and it is on now. It's on the Copake History Facebook page, the link to it. It's divided to 5 sections, but I'll put up an instruction about which sequence you should use. Okay, I'm Howard Blue, I'm the Copake Town historian, and my colleague here and my friend Steve Kaufman is part of Copake royalty. If you knew the Copake pharmacy back in the day, it was his father was the co-owner and co-founder of it. Okay, so I started off this morning thinking I was going to have to beg off practically from all questioning because I've had a bad cough for 2 weeks, but I've dosed myself up this morning, so I think I'm going to be able to do the part that I planned to, and Steve is going to definitely do a few of the interviews, so we're splitting it up. I want to mention quickly that on July 20th, and we'll put out reminders about it, is the last of the 4 panel discussions, and that one will be about the Copake businesses, and that will feature Steve talking about the pharmacy. One other thing, Town Hall features a really very complete 24-panel exhibit on Copake's history, and it's the panels have old photos of the town that various people in the town have made available to me over the years, and relevant text, and I think you'll enjoy it. It's open during Town Hall. You can see it during Town Hall hours, which includes Saturday mornings from, I think, 9 to 12. Okay, so let me introduce now the panel members. And on the left is far left is Edgar Masters. Edgar's family, and certainly Edgar himself, have had immense influence on the town of Copake over decades, many decades, particularly in Copake Falls. Edgar started coming part-time to his family's beautiful place. It used to be called Little Switzerland, am I right?
Little Europe.
Little Europe. But he's lived there full-time for a number of years. Jane Peck is, I'm sorry, I had this sequence mixed up here. Jane Peck, in the middle, had an idyllic childhood growing up in Copake Falls. She totally enjoyed summer and winter sports in the community. Among many other credits, for years she was a swimming teacher in the community and a valued member of the Rojan Historical Society's Board of Directors. And between Jane and Edgar is Fran Miller. Fran now lives across the street here on Empire Road. Nevertheless, because she too had an idyllic childhood in Copake Falls, she regards that community as perhaps the best place in the world to have grown up. For a number of years, Fran worked at Camp Hill Village. Next to the last, like Fran and Edgar, Jed Luchow in the blue Copake Lake t-shirt, which he just happens to have worn today. Jed started out as a summer visitor to the town of Copake, specifically Copake Lake. He enjoyed the lake and caddying, which will be part of his comments. For some years now, he's lived there full-time, contributing in many ways to the betterment of the town of Copake. And last but not least, Joanne Zitek, in the pink, might argue with Jane and Fran that West Copake was the place to grow up. She now lives in the Boston area, but has maintained strong friendships with schoolmates who still live here. I should conclude these introductions by apologizing that for reasons too distracting from what we're doing here today, I was unable to offer you the fuller introduction that all 5 of these people deserve. Okay? So, to start with Edgar. Edgar, your grandfather Francis was the first person in your family to come to Copake Falls. What brought him to the area, and how did he come to buy the land that you now own?
Some of this is repetition of what I have said in the past at the Rojan Historical Society. Those of you that remember possibly what my poor remarks were, if I get them wrong this time, you know, just call it old age or something like that. What brought grandfather here? His hobby was dry fly trout fishing. He had been fishing, so the story goes, in the Berkshires. His wife liked the kind of ritzy attitude of the Berkshires, but he wanted to fish. The water wasn't good or the fishing wasn't great. Somebody said, get a horse and buggy and go over the mountain, what is now Catamount, and fish the Roloff Jansen kiln. He did that. He liked it so much, he realized that he could take the Harlem Division of the New York Central to get there, and he could stay at the Taconic Inn. My wonderful wife, I think from time to time, has wished that my hobby had been fishing instead of acquiring expensive, mechanically handicapped, old antique cars. At least you could eat the fish.
And you're what were the large properties, including Bass Fish Falls, that your grandparents bought, and why did they buy the falls?
Well, two separate things. The acquisition of High Valley began around 1900, and the largest chunk of land that he bought was from the Miles family, who had owned property in that area to make charcoal. I'm guessing they made the charcoal there probably in the 1860s or so, something like that. 1870s, by the time my grandfather came, it was just an abandoned property. There was a barn, a foundation for a house, and a three-hole, according to my dad, a three-hole golf course up there, which I believe had some connection with the Bass Fish Hotel. 1924 or so, when the hotel interests had either disappeared or died, and the danger was that the Bass Fish Falls would become a commercial thing rather than a natural beauty. My grandfather and grandmother bought the Bass Fish Falls and the 200 or so acres that surrounded it, in order to preserve it. They held it for 4 years until the legislature in Massachusetts and Boston created their Park Preserve program, at which time they sold it back at the cost they paid for it to the state of Massachusetts, with the proviso that it remain in the public land, theoretically forever.
And would you talk about... Okay. Would you talk about your grandfather's membership on the Taconic State Park Commission?
The first, well, let's see. There was a young man in and around New York City in the early 1920s whose name was Robert Moses. Preserving land, making what are now state parks, was kind of a higgledy-piggledy process going on throughout New York State. He proposed that it be brought together under one state organization. And in 1924, the governor was Al Smith, they created the New York State Council of Parks, which essentially divided the state up into 13 regions administer state parks, eventually historic sites. Taconic State Park was the first park in the Taconic region. The initial commissioners were a man named Madison Grant. He was famous as a white supremacist, but he had a big hand in protecting the buffalo, which was about to be extinct. And he was a conservationist, along with somewhat, today anyway, antiquated ideas of his role as individual. Another commissioner was Vanderbilt Webb. He was a resident of Hyde Park and therefore knew the Roosevelt family. Another commissioner was a man named James Fleming. We don't know much about Fleming. I believe, I've been told that he was a classmate of Roosevelt's at Groton before Roosevelt went on to Harvard. And the last commissioner was my grandfather, Francis R. Masters.
Thank you. And what was your role in the creation of the Ironworks Museum, which is a very unique institution in this country?
My role was one of several people. Jane Peck, Deb Cohen, Bibb Zelli, David Silvernail was an original director. Robin Bruce, of course, and others who got together, I think at the suggestion of Ray Doherty.
Ray Doherty and Mibbs and Leslie Stromwood, or Wood.
And we talked over what we would do as a friends group. There was the moribund Copake Ironworks, and we decided that we would try to not restore, but preserve that for the future and make it a destination for people to come and learn about how iron was made in 1840s through 1900.
I'll add that Ray, in his role as manager of the park here in Copake Falls, realized that most of the other state parks had a friends group that was supportive of the park and could raise money. We did not, so he really worked hard to make it happen.
Thank you. Would you tell us a little bit about the creation of the construct, for lack of a better term, over the ironworks, the cover over the ironworks furnace, which is quite amazing.
A report was done on the Copake Ironworks, a report on its historical significance and development potential. And this was written by Larry Gobrecht from Peoples Island. He was the sort of leader, I think, up there, number 2 person perhaps in that historical division of New York State Parks, and then park manager Tom Schofield. And it's a wonderful book. I think it's on the Friends of Taconic State Park website. And it gives a history of the falls, gives a history of the ironworks, and some local history of Copake Falls, which is remarkable. But in that book, they suggested that a wooden cover be put over the ruin of the blast furnace. There were trees growing out of it, there were bushes coming out of it, the stones were falling off the side. It was pretty much in trouble. And the first thing was to keep the elements off. The Friends said, we're going to build that roof. The state park sort of looked at us as if we were crazy, but we built that roof. And we had a lot of help from various people in the community and some professionals erecting it, and it's there today. That's how the roof came.
In In his absence, he's asked me to ask you about the creation of the model railroad. That's,
I take exception to the word model.
I'm sorry, he wrote miniature.
I just did. My model railroads are Lionel electric trains. I think that the idea for the railroad came from Mib Zelli, who was very, very active in our organization for a long time. And she kept saying how wonderful it would be if we had a railroad. The original Ironworks Railroad essentially brought iron ore from the mine up along the northern side of the Bashfish Stream till it got above the ironworks, where it crossed on a high wooden trestle bridge, came around, circled around, did a U-turn in effect, and came into the top of the blast furnace. Because the blast furnace, everything was loaded in the top. The iron ore, the charcoal, the lime that made the chemical reaction, and anything else they needed to add to the blast. A second railroad was started at the bottom of the furnace. It ran kind of through where the park dumpster is today and crossed the Bashfish Stream, joined into the other loop on the north side of the Bashfish Stream and back in toward the ore pit. It would have been wonderful if we could have recreated the original Ironworks Railroad. But think of the difficulty in crossing State Route 344 and the Bashfish Stream. We would have been dealing with various bureaucracies well beyond the age of anybody in this room. Plus, we didn't have the money. So we built it in the woods where the state said we could. It is the same gauge as the original one, 3 feet. The engine that we have is similar. If you look at pictures of the old engine, I've lost the name now, but the steam engine that pulled it toward the end of the 1880s, 1890s, there's a picture of that. The engine we have, while it's gas driven, looks a little bit like that engine. And then we've taken some cars and made them kind of look like what maybe an ore car would be.
Thank you, Victor. Thank you very much.
Okay.
And now,
Fran?
Fran.
Fran, how are you?
How are you guys?
We're old friends. We just met a few months ago, but I've known her husband probably 75 years. Fran, how did your family get to Copake Falls? How did you come to Copake?
My grandfather and grandmother came to America in 1911. In Ireland, he was a locomotive driver. He got a job here with some organization in New York City, and he started driving trolleys up in Wood and that area. There was a very bad accident. He was very badly injured. He succumbed to his injuries and left my grandmother here in 1912 with two children and another on the way. And she had to go out to work. No family here to help. So she went out to work and put the kids in daycare. And somebody at daycare said, you know, there's a program from the Church of
Heavenly Rest.
Heavenly Rest. I should never have forgotten that, but so she applied for it and she got it. So she came up and she was totally amazed because she said, as soon as she got here, she looked around and she said, this is just like Cavan where I come from. And of course she was like, I wish I could stay here, but that wasn't in the cards. So she came up for a few years and she did appreciate it very much and she loved it. So I don't know if the program ended, but at about 1932, I believe it was no longer available to her. So at that time, the girls, her daughters had grown, and she decided they were going to come up in the summertime for a week or two, whatever they could afford, which they did. And then later on, when the girls got bigger and they went out to work, they would come up for weeks and weeks in the summertime, and they would live at Goldie Boyle's. I see Billy shaking his head at Goldie's, and that's how I came to Copake Falls when I was a month old. So we just came up and it made it our second home. And then finally in, I don't even remember, in the mid-1950s, my parents bought a house. And all the other people that are associated in Copake Falls, our family, the Flynns and the Froggetts and the Massarellas and the Allens, everybody had summer homes. And that's how we ended up in Copake Falls. And of course, we loved it here because we were used to the Rockaways as a vacation spot. And I love the ocean, but no, it doesn't beat the Ore Pit.
So what were some of your early memories of Copake Falls when you were coming?
Well, the funny thing is, at Goldie's she had boarders. And one of them was an elderly gentleman whose name was Stephen McIntyre, which I found to be very strange. And he used to sit out on the lawn in the front in his chair, and he would kind of watch all the neighborhood kids, because we'd be all out there, running around and doing crazy stuff. And I have no idea. I looked up Stephen McIntyre because the name is synonymous with Copake, and there was no one of his age that I could find, so I'm not quite sure what that was about. But we would go to the Ore Pit every day. We learned to swim there. We would go to Coach Schumacher's summer school. I learned to shoot the bow and arrow and he was who taught me, and he was a lovely, amazing man. And I only went for 2 weeks because there was a boy there that used to beat up the girls. And of course, Fran being who she is.
No names, please.
Me being who I am, I figured I'm going to beat him up. And then my mother said, no, that's not going to happen. You know what? We'll go to the Ore Pit. You know how to shoot the bow. You're fine. We'll go to the Ore Pit. You don't need to be over there beating up the boy. So I was removed. He's gone now. He's gone. The boy in question is gone. So.
Fran, who was Babe the horse?
I'm sorry, Babe the
Babe
Horse.
the horse.
This is the owner, one of the owners of Babe the Horse from Copake Falls. And my sister and I had ridden horses when we were little. And when we met Babe, we were like, oh, we love her. We're going to bring her carrots and apples whenever we go by. And of course, whenever we went to the Ore Pit, we would walk by Babe. And she belonged to the Peck family. Clark, excuse me, the Peck family, I'm sorry. Clark, yes. And she was lovely. She was beautiful.
And around those times, do you recall any problems that occurred in your life here? Any
No.
events that went on that were...
We were little kids, and when I got to be about 6 or 7 years old, my job was to go down to Ruby's and pick up the New York Post and the New York News. And one day there was a front page about something that happened in Copake. And of course I read it on the way home, and it was very frightening. It was 5 children had been murdered. You
I
remember
remember
that?
that very well.
And it was very, very frightening. It happened on a farm someplace in Copake, and I looked it up a while ago. I couldn't find.
But you yourself had a scare when you were with some friends.
Oh, that. Yeah, that. There were a group of us in Copake Falls who hung together all the time. This is when we were preteens or just into teenagehood. And one of the parents had a summer cottage up at a lake in Massachusetts. So we went and we spent the day, we swam, we did whatever you do at the lake in Massachusetts, and we got back to the cabin, and we were gonna prep supper. So we prepped it, and we were just sitting down to eat, and the phone rings. And it's like, the girl whose parents owned it was like, that's weird. So she answers the phone, she hangs it up. She comes and she sits down on the couch and she said, we have a problem. And it's like, well, what's the problem? That was Richard Speck, he's coming to kill us. So now we're like, what's here that we can use as a weapon? So we got a knife and we got some plastic forks. And we're like, well, we'll just have to barricade the door and be done with it. So all of a sudden the girl whose people owned the place said, no, that's not gonna work for my parents. I'm gonna call them. So she called and her father came up right away, but it was so scary because we were in the middle of nowhere, in the dark, and we never could figure out who was the prankster. And then many years later, I was someplace local, and I met the sister of the person, the girl whose people owned the house. And so we started talking about it, and she said, you don't know who it is? And I said, no, none of us know who it is. Who was it? And she told me a name, and I was like, if I see him, I'm gonna punch the living daylights out of him. But I actually heard from him, and he called and he said, you know, I work in Albany and Manhattan, and I haven't seen you in a long time. Why don't we go out to lunch or something? So I said, yeah, that'd be good. Let's go out to lunch. Never said a word about anything else. And then a few weeks later, he passed away. So I didn't get to beat him up.
Lucky guy.
Had to die.
Fran, were you around for the hurricane?
Yes.
1955?
I was at Goldie's. Paul Proper and his family were next door to us. And my sister Jean, who's a little bit younger than me, and PJ Proper, Paul's son, is about the same age as my sister. So when it first started, and it was rain only, not too much wind, we took our little kitty umbrellas and we sat out on the front porch, and our game was, we could see who loses the umbrella the most times to the wind. So I think my sister won that. And overnight, I guess it just got totally out of control. And my mother took us the next morning to walk up to the ore pit just to see, you know, are we gonna swim? And the ore pit was a muddy mess. Somebody back there can say yes to that, I think. I'm checking you out, Nancy. And it was a mess. The bridge was gone. One of the miners' cottages had been sucked down the creek. Yeah, and the bridge in Copake was gone. So for us kids at the young age, it was like, what the heck is going on here? But it was interesting. We'd never seen the ore pit filled with mud, which meant no swimming.
So, you grew up on Long Island, but you live here now. What are the differences between your life down there and your life here, would you say?
Well, it's nice and quiet here.
I didn't do
Did
it.
the power ever go out up there?
Or you'll have to speak up.
I'll try. It was nice and quiet here in Copake at that time. Very quiet and beautiful. Yes. It was good. Yeah. So that was one thing. There were not as many people. We had the ocean down there in the Sound, and up here we have the ore pit, which is the best. It was just very different, but the same. I mean, the people were the same, you know, everybody worked together. And the Copake it's my favorite.
But the pizza
Copake
wasn't the
Falls.
same, was it, Fran?
Excuse me?
The pizza wasn't the same.
Oops. I didn't hear
The
you.
pizza
pizza wasn't the same.
And it's still not the same, I'm sorry to say. I can't help that. But, yeah, pizza wasn't.
So one last comment that we
What?
spoke about. You spent all the time there in Copake Falls, and you married someone from Copake. You live in Copake now. What's the difference between Copake and Copake Falls?
Falls.
And that's not written here either.
Copake Falls was smaller, quieter. Everybody got along mostly. As kids, you could go up to the orchid by yourself, you know, as long as you could swim and you knew the lifeguards, and everybody did. And because we were in Copake Falls, not only did we have the coach to do the teaching, but my mother and her sisters used to, there was like, remember the little mud puddle on the side of the orchid? Well, my mother used to have a swimming group there for kids. I went out to the float when I was like 4. Jean went out to the float when she was 5. It was just very different. I can't explain it.
Fran, one last question. Was there any special place to take a shower and wash your hair in Copake Falls?
Yes, there was. And it's a secret, a deep, dark secret.
Well, give a
If
general.
you go up to Bash Fish, and you can't do it now because you can't get into the pool, but if you go up to the pool, and you swim around and you kind of explore things, there's one section that we used to call our personal shower. And as young ladies, we used to gather our shampoo, our towels, our food for the day, a transistor radio that never worked up there, and we would go and we'd swim around and, you know, do whatever we wanted to do. And then we would go home. Before we went home, we would wash our hair. We all had long hair at the time. So we would wash our hair with our shampoo in our personal shower. And as I said, it's a secret, but if you're up there and you can be up there when somebody's not being nosy and doing their job, you might be able to find a shower. Sorry
Thank you.
to tell you. You're welcome.
Okay, moving on, Jane, another Copake Falls resident. How did your family get to come to Copake Falls?
My dad was born in the town of Northeast, and when he was a young child, they moved out to western New York along the Delaware River, and sometime in his late teens, I would say, he and his brother came back to the Millerton area, and somehow my dad migrated, and when he got drafted into World War I in 1917, he was working at the time for Francis Masters. So he came back to Copake Falls when he got out of the service. He married Amelius, and when she died in the 30s, he and my mother met on Mount Washington around 1943, and got married and built their house on Cemetery Road in Copake Falls. My dad built the house in 1945-46.
And did you go to the little school here?
No, I went to Rojan for kindergarten.
How did you avoid going here? Did everyone from Copake Falls just go there?
We went to Rojan, yeah.
Okay. But your kids went here, you said?
My 2 sons went to kindergarten down here, and my youngest son was there for 1st grade. Yeah.
Was Mrs. Wilson still there?
No, they had Betty Avina.
For clarification, here means next door at the little school.
Right.
And you're known as a pretty good swimmer. Where did you learn to swim?
Well, we had a fairly large, actually it was one of the iron ore pits on our property. And we spent many hours in and around on whatever you could do on water or around it, we did it. So my dad insisted that we learn to swim. He always said he couldn't swim. I never saw him in the water, so probably he couldn't. And then my mom would take us to the kiddie pool, and eventually Coach Shoemaker had swimming lessons in the kiddie pool and the orbit. There was an area, the bathhouse is there now is the third one that I remember. The first one was right down near the water. As you stand on the dock looking at the float way over to the left, and you could touch there. Coach would stand right where the rocks dropped off sharply, and so he could protect us from falling in the deep water. And that's pretty much where I learned to swim. And one summer, or 2 summers, I forget, the 2 lifeguards gave us swimming and diving lessons.
We call him Coach Shoemaker. How do you think his influence was of the programs that he did for the little towns like Copake Falls?
Indescribable. I mean, early on he realized there was nothing for the kids in the general area to do in the summer. So he started the playground program. He had playgrounds in Copake, Copake Falls, Prairieville, Copake Lake, and Hillsdale. And he circulated around. He had swimming lessons on Tuesdays and Thursdays. Eventually he migrated to Robinson Pond for the swimming lessons. And, you know, programs were well attended. We had a ball.
Yeah. And did you teach swimming from all the knowledge you gained from it?
Yeah, I did. Pretty much for 20 years for the town of Copake. 2 years of that time I taught at Greenwich House Camp. And then the town of Copake, and eventually the town of Hillsdale and Ankrum. We did that in the Ankrum pool.
Right.
She ran the park program in Copake for quite a few years also.
Yeah, I did.
They were great programs. I actually spoke to his daughter recently about the different things, and he was very concerned when he first came here. And he started at the little school, that's the building next door. And his daughter tells the story of the Ackleys walking up, and they're yelling, "Go home, Grover, go home, Grover." And his name was Grover Shoemaker. Everyone thought they were telling him to go home, but it was their black dog that was following them home. And they were telling Grover, go home. And his first time doing the park here, he hears, "Go home, Grover." He didn't know what to do. But it worked out okay.
He was well respected.
Yeah. And what kind of special events went on in Copake Falls?
Well, the fire company was an instrumental piece of the community. They had in the summer like a fair, let's say, with throwing darts at the board and bingo and all the carnival games. I don't think we had any rides. The fire women auxiliary had Christmas parties and Halloween parties that we look forward to all year.
Yeah.
And the fire company also had as far as I know, only once a year, a huge barbecue that everybody went to. And then there was the Legion Hall that also had barbecues and dances, and at one point that I don't remember, maybe it's because I was too young, plays on the stage. They were really a central part of the community.
And a great pancake dinner during honeymoon.
Oh yeah, don't forget the pancakes.
Yeah.
But I really liked the clam bake that the Legion Hall had.
Yeah, I remember, who sponsored that?
The American Legion, yeah.
Your pit day.
Yeah, they dug a huge pit and put the clams and the sweet corn and whatever else, and buried it in seaweed and let it go all day.
I remember when the ticket got up, it was $4.75 for a ticket for that, all day eating and drinking.
Right.
And I remember my mother and father saying, "Well, should we go this year? It seems like it went up a lot." And I think $4.75 is quite reasonable for what went on there.
It went on all night, I think. My parents took us home, put us to bed, and they went back.
Where did you go shopping in Copake Falls? Or where?
My earliest memory is just going to Groovy's. And we had an account, and Mom would send us down to get hamburger for supper, and we'd go down and get the hamburger and walk home. One summer, my dad never complained about the bills. He paid the bills. Mom didn't know where the money came from or where it went. I don't think she cared.
And yet she worked.
Not then.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, she didn't start working until I was in high school. But one summer, Dad comes upstairs and says, "Catherine, why is this bill from Groovy so expensive?" Well, I don't know. He looks at it, and I don't know. Somebody went down to Groovy's and asked. Well, it turns out that my brother Stuart and our neighbor across the street, Jimmy Milius, had decided that ice cream was on the ticket every morning for breakfast. And they each bought a pint of ice cream every morning.
And Groovy's, for those of you who don't know, is where the post office is today in Copake Falls. And a leftover from Groovy's is that they have a storage place, I believe, I'm told, in the post office, which was a freezer, but they're keeping, I guess, paper documents in there.
Yeah, the original meat locker was still there too. And then, a little later, we did some shopping at the Copake General Store. Going to the Hudson or Great Barrington was a major trip. We just didn't do it.
And did you have a party line?
Oh,
One
yeah.
of the last panels, Judy Ackman was discussing the party lines.
Right.
You have party line where you?
Yeah, yeah.
And what? Can you tell me what that's like?
Well, you would hear the phone. We each had distinctive rings. I think ours was one long, three short. And people across the road might have been one long, two short, and Blair's next door might have been four short, something like that. So it was our family, Milius's, the Lairs, a summer residence, the Plains on North Mountain Road, and for some reason it kind of jumped, and then the Emersons across at the corner of North Mountain Road and 344. And they had 5 kids, 7 kids.
7, 5, 6.
And they were on the phone all the time, which was a problem when Dad needed to make a business call.
Did you ever listen in?
Not really, no. No.
Oh, thanks.
I had Agnes and Seth line.
Yeah.
Some of the things, yeah.
One moment, please.
We didn't have a party line, but we had calls coming day and night anytime they needed something from the drugstore.
I remember my mother telling the story that I was born in 1946, so this was probably October 46. I was crying away. She didn't know what to do with me. She called your dad. He said, it's like 2 o'clock in the morning. And he said, come down to the pharmacy, I'll meet you there. So he meets her at the pharmacy and hands her Dr. Spock and says, here, go home, read this.
Yeah, pretty good sense of humor. And you survived.
Okay. Jed, tell us how your family came here.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. We're from Brooklyn. We were vacationing in Old Forge, New York, and my parents were avid bridge players. They played at the Fort Hamilton Officers Club in Brooklyn, underneath what is now the Verrazano Bridge. But they had 2 couples that they played bridge with, both of whom had connections to Copake Lake, one whose family was here for quite a long time, and the other gentleman was a waiter at the hotel. His wife would often say and remind people that while her husband was a waiter, she was a guest She went to Barnard College, class of 1939, and wanted us to know that she was a guest at the country club. And so the story really begins understanding about Copake Lake. Copake Lake is about 430 acres. It has on it two bodies of land. One is an island and one is a peninsula. The island is known as Mosquito Island, and it cannot be built on because there's no place to be able to put septic systems. The peninsula is today referred to as the island, but it really isn't. There is a very small body of land that allows you to come off Lakeview Road onto that body of land. And on that body of land was the Copake Country Club. And I wanted to bring, by the way, I'm a former teacher, so please bear with the artifacts that I bring, but I just wanted you to see this, if you can see this banner. This is from the 1950s. It's an ad
Hold it
for...
vertically if you would.
Oh.
Yeah, good.
It's an ad for the Copake Country Club. That was, and you can see from the bathing suits, etc., of the 1950s. But the reason I mention this is that I never knew it, pardon me, I never knew it as anything other than the Copake Country Club, which consisted of a hotel, cottages on what today is called the island, and it had attached to it a golf course that was available to the vacationers at the hotel. So there was, the word today when we say in the area the Copake Country Club, we seem to think of it as the golf course. Back when I got here in the early 60s, it was one entity, which was the hotel, which had a main building and about 20 cottages on what is today called the island, which is divided up today such that there are 16 homes. But at that time, there were about 20 cottages. The main building and the cottages had no heat, no air conditioning. It was basically Memorial Day weekend to Labor Day weekend. And the one thing that put Copake on the hotel map was it was owned by primarily Jewish families, very much like the Catskills, in terms of Copake was about the only hotel of its kind on our side of the Hudson, other than the hotels that were in and around Tanglewood. But basically what differentiated Copake from the Catskills was, at the Catskills, most of the hotels were Jewish-style food, meaning that there was no ham, no bacon, no shellfish, etc. At Copake, which was all owned by Jewish families, on Friday nights, you could have a traditional Jewish Friday night dinner, which was often chicken soup and roasted chicken, but your guests could order lobsters. And that really set up. By the time I got here in 1962, the planes coming in from Maine, delivering the lobsters and landing on Copake Lake, were no longer doing that because there was refrigeration. But in the earlier days, seaplanes regularly landed on Copake Lake to deliver the lobsters. What I want to do is, in the time that I have, I want to bring you from the early 1900s through today by talking about the development of the area around the lake, the hotel, its connection to Prairieville, and ultimately the eutrophication of Copake Lake, which is a dying cycle.
Jed, could I ask you before you get to that? You caddied, and I think you have some interesting things to say about caddying and then what replaced We're
Okay.
trying to replace caddy. You talked
Okay.
about that?
Yes. Copake Lake, as I said, the hotel was owned the land of the golf course. That was one entity. I also want to say that along with that main building and those 25 cottages, there were 30 other cottages that were owned by the Copake Lake Development Corporation. That's the owners of the hotel. 18 of those cottages were along the golf course. Today we call it Golf Course Road. There was no Golf Course Road then. There was simply a road that ran along the golf course from the clubhouse to the 18th green. 18 cottages. They were on the water. When I walked out over our deck off the living room area, the front stanchions of our deck were in the water. So when you sat on your rocker, you were looking down at the water. So 18 of those cottages were along the golf course side, and over on the County Route 7 side, and most of us know there is no continuous road that goes around Copake Lake. The road ends at the end of the golf course area, and then on the other side, it ends near where Southwest Colony and the Cove Colony areas begin.
Jed, I'm a little
Okay.
concerned about time, but I don't want to go away from you without hearing your comments about
So-
the caddy.
Okay, so on the golf course, if you know Copake Country Club golf courses, it's very hilly. In the early 1960s, there were no golf carts. There were caddies. So either you carried your own bag or you took a caddy. My first summer job up here at age 15 was caddying. We carried 2 bags for 18 holes. The caddy master took back $1 per bag at the end of the 18 holes. So we had to return $2. How much did we get for the caddying of the 2 bags for 18 holes? Anybody? $10. Which for me at 15 in 1962 was an awful lot of money. But if the people who you were working for were very nice, they actually gave you $12 so that you could return the $2 to the caddy master and you walked home with a $10 bill. Now, during that time, things began to improve in terms of technology, and golf carts began to come in on Copake Lake. I brought another picture to show you. The first golf carts were metal 3-wheel golf carts. Very heavy, very unbalanced. If you know anything about the Copake course, there are many parts of it that are very sloped. So after the first 3 weeks in 1963, 64, when the first several carts turned over onto people, the management said, this is not a good idea, bring the caddies back. So now I had my summer job back, no change in price, but I had my summer job back. The following summer, they decided they've got to get rid of those 3-wheel carts, and they came up with 4-wheel electric carts. Now we're talking 1963, 64. Think about the size of batteries in electric golf carts in 1963, 64. If you were good enough to drive from tee to green and tee to green, you could make it through 18 holes, hopefully. Almost nobody made it through 18 holes because they ran out of battery. So the trick was, by around the 16th or 17th hole, you called back to the group behind you and you said, help. And you heard, help, 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 help. There were no cell phones. So ultimately, the clubhouse would either send out another battery if they had one, or a cart, or a caddy to carry back the clubs for the 2 or 3 holes that couldn't go. And that was, again, another summer of being able to caddy at Copake.
Thank you.
Great.
Thank you. I mean, thank you. Our last panelist is Joanne Zitek, and a friend for a long time. And when Howard was putting the panel together, I said, we can't talk about the towns surrounding Copake. We're not talking about West Copake, and Joanne was born in West Copake. And very interesting background about West Copake. So how did you come to West Copake, Joanne, your family?
Steve, I'm happy to answer that question, but first I want to take a poll of people in the audience. How many people have a connection with West Copake? You either lived there once or you do now. Okay, a small but significant representation. That's great. My family came to West Copake when my father was in his early 20s. He lived in Mount Vernon, New York, which, as you know, is the first town after Manhattan, after Harlem, really. And he came up with some buddies to hunt and fish. And because he discovered he loved the area. It was incredibly beautiful. He hunted all kinds of animals and fished all kinds of fish. And he particularly enjoyed deer hunting. And would use the rifle like most people did initially, and then as the years went by, he became an avid archer. And so after a while he quit. I was telling Edgar Masters, and I'll make the connection in a minute to Mr. Masters, but after a while he quit using the rifle because he felt the deer didn't have a chance. And so he hunted in his latter years exclusively with a bow and arrow, because he felt that the deer had a more even chance that way.
And where did he stay when he came up?
When he came up, along with his older brother and a couple of buddies, they would lodge at the home of Bucky Cornell, who was about his age. Bucky's father's name was Ed Cornell, and they had a house in latter years, although I understand they moved around, they had a house on Upper Rhoda Lake. And my father, being a city boy, I assume he learned to hunt and fish from the Cornells, from Bucky and Ed.
What are some of, to me, I don't want to give my editorial, but the towns around Copake, the fire company, and events sponsored local fire company, became a very big part of the town. Can you talk about some of that in West Copake?
Well, absolutely. One of the things about the fire company that I loved was that the West Copake Fire Company, this is, fire company number 3, and it was just down the street from our house. And every summer, one Saturday night, they would have a block party. And they would block off traffic. They would string these beautiful lights, which I had never seen as a kid, and they'd have a real band and refreshments and food. I think it was square dancing. Even we kids danced sometimes. It was a wonderful time. Also, the fire department figured as a sort of a community organization in other ways, because at least in West Copake, many of the men joined the fire department. I think they felt it was a responsibility. And a lot of the women participated in the auxiliary. And the fire department, the chiefdom of the fire department, the role of being chief, rotated. So for a while my father was the chief, and many other men in the community took their turn being the chief also.
Where did the trucks come from that the department had?
Well, what I remember in particular is that when the West Copake Fire Department needed a new truck, or a new to them truck, they found that they could get a used fire truck from a Native American reservation in western Massachusetts. At the time, I knew the name of the specific reservation, the specific tribe. And so a group of firemen drove there the distance to bring the fire truck back. And I think it's possible they even bought a second truck from the same tribe. And over time, a relationship developed between the West Copake Fire Department and that tribe. And to be exact, they, at the annual Memorial Day Firemen's Parade, The tribe came one time with their truck and marched in the parade.
When the fire company was volunteer, and you would have told me a story about some of the training and deficiencies in training with a fire truck. Can you expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, this happened before my time, but I grew up hearing about it. My father had a cousin, his last name I think was Broadbeck, yes, who had preceded him moving to Copake full time. I think they owned the building that became Ernie Engelbart's. And he was a member of the fire department as well. And as one of the fires, driving either to or fro the fire, that big tank of water was apparently half full, and the driver didn't totally compensate for the movement of the water in the tank, and the truck at a turn, it was going a little too fast, it fell over, and it crushed and killed my father's cousin. So I grew up hearing about that, and my father my father always took very seriously the training that was offered to fire departments, to volunteer fire departments around the state.
You mentioned Ernie Engelbart. Ernie Engelbart, to me, is one of the characters of West Copake. Who's Ernie Engelbart?
Well, that's the right word, Steve. He was a character indeed. Engelbart's store was built in what had been, I think, a 3-car garage in West Copake, adjacent to their house. And it was a little general store and gas pumps. And, well, like Jane mentioned, we had a tab there. We didn't have to pay money because at the end of the month, Ernie would give my mother the bill for what we bought. And so my mother or I would go down every day to buy the New York newspaper because she believed we needed to know what was going on beyond Copake. And so when I would go in as a kid to buy something, I never had to use money. And one time I had one of my friends going with me, and I think we were getting ice cream, but not every morning. And she was amazed that I could just say, you know, go into the freezer, take the ice cream out and wave it in front of Ernie, and he would put it on the tab, and that was okay. She thought that was real luxury. So I mentioned that Ernie was a character. I should describe him to you in case you didn't have the chance to meet him. He was a German immigrant and spoke with an accent. He was a stout man with a thick mustache, and dressing well for the job was not his strong point. Let me just put it that way. So in hot weather, he would have one of those stringy t-shirts on, and anyhow, not very savory, but the nicest, kindest man you could imagine. To be exact, when he would go to Hudson once a month to get provisions to stock his store, he would sometimes, on the way home, stop at my house, at my mother's house, mother and father's, and be like in the middle of the day. That's why I say my mother's house. And he would hand her a bouquet of flowers that he would buy in Hudson. And he would always say to her, I don't believe in giving people flowers when they're dead. I like to give it to them when they're alive. And I was saying to Howard that at first my father thought, what is this man doing, bringing my wife flowers? But he, after a while, got used to it and realized it was a beautiful gesture. Oh, I think you wanted me to say something else about his involvement with the fire company, right, Steve?
Whatever you'd like.
Okay, here goes. I understand from Howard that, and working with Howard and Steve about this has been a wonderful experience because I've learned a lot about my hometown. I understand he sold the land, Ernie Engelbart sold the land that the fire company built their firehouse on for $1, according to Howard. And he also supported the fire department in other ways. I don't think he ever rode on the truck, that sort of wasn't his thing. But each time the firemen had their meeting, which was probably monthly, he, having a grocery store, would bring cold cuts and things like that. My father used to say, come home and say, yes, Ernie put on a spread for the boys. That's what he would call it, a spread for the boys. The other thing he did was at noon every day, he walked from his little store in the back, in the little path, directly to the fire company, and rang the fire siren to test the bell at noon every day. So that's how you knew it was noon.
Joy, in West Copake, how many camps would you say that there were summer camps?
Oh, depending on how you count them, I think there were about 5. There was Ferrazdale up the street, there was Upper Rhoda Camp, there was what's now Oleana, I think, and then down the road was Natchez.
Natchez, Pontiac.
Camp Barrington also, yes, that's right, on Upper Rhoda Lake too.
So in the summer months, how do all these people get mail from home?
Aha, he's feeding right into my experience. Very good questions. One of my first, maybe my first summer job was I was the assistant to the assistant postmistress in West Copake, New York. And at that time, Irene Siebert was the postmistress. This is before Emily Bloss was the postmistress. And Irene Siebert lived on a bit of a knoll right next to Upper Rhoda Lake. And her post office was in her sun porch. It was the converted end of her house. And she and her assistant, her year-round assistant, whose first name was Thelma, I can't remember her last name, Wilcox, I think, they needed extra help in the summertime because the camps got so much mail. They had extra volume. So I was hired for 4 hours a day, 2 hours in the morning and 2 hours in the afternoon to sort the mail. And then I would swim at Irene's waterfront in between time. I'd go home and have lunch, and then I would go swimming with my friends in the afternoon.
And did you meet any interesting people that picked up the mail for the camps?
Oh, yes. There was this guy who worked for the camps. I was a teenager, young teenager at the time. I'll never forget him. He had sort of reddish hair. He drove this little dark green MG, and it had Colorado plates. And he came in, that was his job among other things, to pick up the mail. He came in every day, and I just pined away for him. He never noticed me, but to this day I can see him in his little green MG.
We talked about a lot of things over the last few weeks, and people may have some questions, but is there anything you'd like to say about West Copake that really stands out to you growing up there and the memories of it, other than what you've said already?
Well, we knew most of the families. I referred to swimming at Irene Siebert's lakefront property, and that's one of my strongest memories. I guess most of my real memories are outside, because it's so beautiful around here. And Irene had rented that lakefront property to one of the camps earlier on, and they had built a wooden structure, a dock with a floor, submerged floor. And then after the agreement with the camp ended, she then allowed a fair number of local families to swim there. And some of the men built a float that we could swim to. I see Nancy shaking her head. I think she came swimming with me a couple times. And we went every single afternoon, as soon as we could after lunch. And it was like the Blosses, Wendy and Mary Linda and Jerry Bloss and Doris Johnson and various other people. And it was heaven to me. And as I told Howard, Fran, you weren't the only one who washed your hair. We would wash our hair in the lake. That was before we knew it wasn't a great thing to do. But that was heavenly. And then one of my other memories involves some of the same kids that I just mentioned, including Paul Kennefick. And I was telling Stephen Howard that I was not particularly athletic. And I was an only child. And so one of the things I was really bad at was catching the ball. So when we played softball, no one wanted to throw it to me on my team. So my parents got wind of that, and my father was nice enough after dinner, let's say when I was 10 or so, to take me out to play catch afterwards, and that helped a little bit. And then a little time went on, and we had a fairly big lawn on the side of the house, and we got into this habit where after supper every night, the local kids would come, the same ones I just mentioned, and we would play softball on that lawn until it was so dark you couldn't see anymore. And you know, it just didn't matter anymore that I couldn't catch. I mean, it was just so much fun. We just had a great time, and my parents never had grass on that part of the lawn for a decade, but they didn't seem to care.
I want to ask this question about something that long preceded your being around. But in the mid-19th century, until 1918, when they died, the Astor family, Henry and his wife, made a big impact on the community with the Astor money. He was the grandson of the richest man in the world at that time. And I'm wondering whether that legacy came to your knowledge when you were growing up. At one time it was called Astorville, in fact, West Copake.
Yes, it did, sort of in two levels. Growing up, I knew that the house that I lived in was built on a cornfield, a former cornfield, which prior to that, I was told, had been part of the Astor estate. And I knew that the camp that we were adjacent to was, which is now Oleana, as we said, that was the land that had been the Astor estate. I grew up hearing all that. And then I moved away, and time went by, and I thought, did I imagine that? I mean, because if you grow up in New York, there's certain names you hear that are just synonymous with money, like Astor, Rockefeller, you know, some of those names. And I thought, did I imagine that, or did I really know that? And then I've been connected with Linda Lampman from, you know, over the years, and so she had some articles that she found about the history of Astor, and I guess, Howard, correct me if I'm wrong, but I learned that the Astor who owned that land was sort of the black sheep in the family who had married, I don't know, a woman of ill repute, and so he decamped to
Not ill repute, but below his station.
Okay.
That's what it was.
Which I kind of liked that. I thought that was great. And so, yeah, so I realized that what I had heard growing up was in fact true.
Thank you very much. Thank you, all of you. We spent collectively quite a bit of time talking about a lot of this, and I'm hearing today some new things that I had not heard before. Jane, your little story about the ice cream, it's a winner. So that was great. We have time for some questions now.
Mike, and then I just want to put a plug in for next week. The Historical Society opens up their exhibit, and there's Henry Astor stuff, and there's Copake Lake golf stuff from the early period, and a bunch of other stuff. I was over there the other day working with them a little bit. I would recommend anybody that had a good time here, you go over there and you'll see this, what they're talking about. Absolutely stunning. It's great.
Thank you. Deb?
I just wanted to ask Jed if you would write up your history that we don't have time for today and publish it in the Copake Connection. Sounds like it would be very interesting.
Thank you.
Yes.
Edgar, when your parents bought all that property up here, you said like multiple acres. What did your father do that he was able to afford to buy that much land?
It was my grandfather.
Grandfather.
He was a woolen merchant, and he basically sold woolen cloth that was manufactured in New England to people who would make garments, upholstery, wool. You know, probably next to cotton was the most popular fabric. There were no synthetics at that point. He apparently, his father, my great-grandfather, had been a minister in Beacon, and my father always said that his grandfather was kind of church mouse poor. No, grandfather apparently was very successful at his being a woolen merchant. Worth Street in Manhattan was the center of the textile industry in years gone by. He had his own company there for a few years, and then he sold it to the American Woolen Company, which was a large woolen company. No, I think it was wool, sheep, which were never my favorite on the farm, but were the beginnings of the wealth that provided the land. Yeah.
I'd like to make a comment that pertains to the previous panels that we had. There are quite a number of familial connections in Copake, as many of you are aware. Now, not so much in this panel, except that Fran's husband, over here, okay, Wayne Fuzzy Miller, is connected by blood to the Ackleys, Fuller, Pells. Who did I leave out?
Oh God, there's probably many names in Copake that family tree. I mean, just it all connects.
And this has to do with the fact that some of these families have been here for several centuries. Okay, next question. If not, oh yes.
So I worked here in 1960 as a lifeguard at the Copake Lake Country Club. And entering the island, there was a bridge. And there was a stream that ran underneath that bridge. So in my mind, it was always an island, not a peninsula.
Okay.
And I said it was the best summer of my life.
All right. And I add to that, that in doing some research some time ago, I read reference to that island as Queen Anne's Island. And I don't think anybody on Copake Lake knows that term, but this is going back to maybe the Livingstons' time when they were first coming here. So you never know what you come up with when you dig. Thank you again.